The room was silent except for the sound of heavy breathing. My heart pounded like a drum as I stared at the pregnancy test in my hand. 2 lines. Positive. My younger sister, Ada, sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale, her hands trembling. She was only 14. I was 16. The weight of what we had done crashed down on me like a storm. How did we get here? How did I let this happen? My mind raced back to the beginning, to the day everything changed. The day my older sister, Neka, did something to me that I could never forget. Something that started this chain of events. But before I could explain, there was a loud knock on the door. It was our father. His voice boomed, "Open this door right now." Ada and I froze. What were we going to do? It all started 6 years ago, when I was just 10 years old. I was a happy boy, always playing outside with my friends in our small village. My family was poor, but we were happy. My father worked hard as a farmer, and my mother sold vegetables at the market. I had 2 sisters, Neka, who was 14, and Ada, who was just 8. Neka was the one who took care of us when our parents were busy. She was like a second mother to us. But one day, everything changed. It was a hot afternoon, and I had just come back from playing football with my friends. I was tired and sweaty, so I went to take a bath. As I was washing myself, Neka walked into the bathroom. I was surprised because she never came in when I was bathing. She closed the door behind her and locked it. My heart started to beat faster. "Neka, what are you doing?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked closer to me. I felt scared, but I didn't know why. She touched me in a way that made me feel uncomfortable. I tried to push her away, but she was stronger than me. "Don't tell anyone," she whispered. "This is our secret." I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew it was wrong. After that day, Neka would come into my room at night and do things to me. I was too young to understand, but I knew it wasn't right. I wanted to tell my parents, but I was afraid. Afraid of what Neka would do. Afraid of what my parents would say. So I kept it a secret. Years went by, and the abuse continued. But as I grew older, something inside me changed. I started to feel angry. Angry at Neka for what she had done to me. Angry at myself for not stopping her. And then, one day, I did something I never thought I would do. I was 16, and Ada was 14. We were alone in the house, just like Neka and I used to be. I looked at Ada, and something inside me snapped. I didn't think about the consequences. I didn't think about how wrong it was. All I could think about was the anger and pain I had been carrying for so long. And then, I did the unthinkable. I touched Ada in the same way Neka had touched me. She didn't fight back. She just looked at me with tears in her eyes. I felt sick to my stomach, but I couldn't stop myself. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare, and I couldn't wake up. Now, here we were, 2 months later, staring at a positive pregnancy test. Ada was crying softly, and I felt like the worst person in the world. What had I done? How could I have let this happen? The knocking on the door grew louder. I said, "Open this door," our father shouted. My hands were shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I knew that once I opened that door, there was no going back. Our lives would never be the same. But I had no choice. I turned the knob, and the door swung open. My father stood there, his face red with anger. "What is going on here?" he demanded. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could I explain something I didn't even understand myself? And then, before I could say anything, Ada spoke. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My father's eyes widened in shock. He looked at me, then at Ada, then back at me. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice trembling with rage. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could do was stand there, waiting for the storm to hit. And then, My father raised his hand. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the blow. But it never came. Instead, I heard my mother's voice. "Stop," she shouted. I opened my eyes and saw her standing in the doorway, her face filled with pain and disbelief. "What is happening in this house?" she asked. No one answered. The silence was deafening. And then, my father spoke. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold and hard. All of us. I knew that this was just the beginning. The beginning of a nightmare that would change our lives forever. The air in the small living room was thick with tension. My father sat on the wooden chair, his face like a dark cloud ready to burst. My mother stood beside him, her arms crossed, her eyes filled with tears. Ada and I sat on the floor, our heads bowed, unable to look at them. Neka was not there. She had left the village a year ago to live with our aunt in the city. I wished she were here. Maybe then, I wouldn't feel so alone. But deep down, I knew that even if she were here, she wouldn't help me. She was the one who started all of this. "Speak," my father shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "How did this happen?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. How could I explain something so terrible? How could I tell them that I had hurt Ada in the same way Neka had hurt me? Ada was crying softly, her shoulders shaking. My mother knelt down beside her and wrapped her arms around her. "It's okay, my child," she whispered. "Tell us the truth." Ada looked up at me, her eyes filled with fear and sadness. I knew I had to say something. I had to take responsibility for what I had done. "It was me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I did it." My father's face turned red with anger. He stood up so quickly that his chair fell over. "You did what?" he roared. I flinched, expecting him to hit me. But instead, he just stood there, staring at me with a look of pure disgust. "How could you do this to your own sister?" he asked. "How could you betray our family like this?" I didn't have an answer. All I could do was sit there, feeling like the worst person in the world. My mother started to cry. "This is not our son," she said, shaking her head. "This is not the boy we raised." Her words cut through me like a knife. I wanted to tell her that I was still her son, that I was still the boy she raised. But how could I? How could I explain that I had been broken by what Neka had done to me? That I had carried that pain for so long, and it had finally exploded in the worst possible way? I couldn't. So I just sat there, silent and ashamed. My father paced back and forth, his hands clenched into fists. "This cannot stay in this house," he said. "If the village finds out, we will be disgraced. Our family will be ruined." My mother nodded, her face pale. "What should we do?" she asked. My father stopped pacing and looked at me. "You will leave," he said. "You will go to the city and stay with your uncle. You will not come back until this is resolved." I felt a lump in my throat. Leave. Leave my home. My family. But I knew I had no choice. I had brought this upon myself. Ada looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," I whispered to her. She didn't say anything. She just looked away. My heart ached. I had hurt her, and now I was being sent away. But maybe it was for the best. Maybe leaving would give her a chance to heal. My father handed me a small bag with some clothes and a little money. "Go," he said. "And don't come back until I say so." I nodded, my eyes filled with tears. I wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. So I just picked up the bag and walked out the door. The sun was setting as I walked down the dirt road that led out of the village. I didn't know what awaited me in the city, but I knew it couldn't be worse than what I had left behind. As I walked, I thought about Ada. I thought about the pain I had caused her. And I thought about Neka. She was the one who had started all of this. She was the one who had broken me. And now, because of her, I had broken someone else. I didn't know if I could ever forgive myself. But I knew one thing for sure, I would never forget what had happened. And I would never let it happen again. As I reached the edge of the village, I heard a voice behind me. Wait. I turned around and saw Ada running toward me. My heart skipped a beat. What was she doing here? She stopped in front of me, breathing heavily. I'm coming with you, she said. I stared at her in shock. What? No, Ada, you can't, I said. You have to stay here. You have to be safe. She shook her head. I don't feel safe here, she said. Not after what happened. I need to get away too. I didn't know what to say. I knew it was wrong to let her come with me, but I also knew I couldn't leave her behind. Not after everything we had been through. So we walked together, leaving the village behind. We didn't know what the future held, but we knew we couldn't go back. As we walked, I thought about the road ahead. It would be long and difficult, but maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to heal. To start over. To be better. But as we walked into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The city was nothing like our village. The streets were crowded, the noise was deafening, and the air smelled of smoke and sweat. Ada and I clung to each other as we navigated through the chaos. We had never been to the city before, and everything felt overwhelming. My uncle's house was supposed to be our safe haven, but as we stood in front of the small, crumbling building, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. What would he say when he saw us? Would he even let us in? I knocked on the door, my heart pounding. After a few moments, it creaked open, and my uncle's face appeared. He looked older than I remembered, his hair grayer, his face more lined. He stared at us in surprise. Chinedu. Ada. What are you doing here? He asked. I swallowed hard, trying to find the words. We need your help, I said. My uncle's eyes narrowed as he looked at us. What happened? He asked. I glanced at Ada, who was staring at the ground. It's a long story, I said. My uncle sighed and stepped aside. Come in, he said. The house was small and cluttered, but it was clean. My uncle led us to the living room and gestured for us to sit down. Tell me everything, he said. I took a deep breath and began to explain. I told him about Neka, about what she had done to me when I was younger. I told him about the anger and pain I had carried for so long, and how it had led me to hurt Ada. I told him about the pregnancy, about our father's rage, and about being sent away. My uncle listened in silence, his face growing darker with each word. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. This is a heavy burden, he said. But you cannot run from it. You must face it. I nodded, tears filling my eyes. I know, I said. But I don't know how. My uncle looked at Ada, who was still staring at the ground. And you, my child, he said. How do you feel? Ada looked up, her eyes filled with tears. I'm scared, she whispered. I don't know what's going to happen to me. To us. My uncle reached out and took her hand. You are not alone, he said. We will figure this out together. His words brought a small sense of comfort, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. We had a long road ahead of us. Over the next few days, my uncle helped us settle in. He gave us a small room to share and made sure we had enough to eat. He also took us to see a doctor, who confirmed Ada's pregnancy. The doctor was kind and understanding, but I could see the judgment in his eyes. I knew we were being judged everywhere we went. The city was not as forgiving as we had hoped. People whispered behind our backs, and some even refused to serve us at the market. It was hard, but we tried to stay strong. We had no other choice. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, my uncle looked at us with a serious expression. We need to make a plan, he said. You cannot stay here forever. You need to think about the future. I nodded, knowing he was right. But what future did we have? I had no education, no skills, and no money. Ada was pregnant, and we had no idea how we would take care of a child. The weight of our situation felt crushing. What should we do? I asked. My uncle thought for a moment. First, we need to tell your parents, he said. They need to know the truth. All of it. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Telling our parents about Nneka's abuse was something I had never wanted to do. But I knew it was necessary. We couldn't keep hiding the truth. The next day, my uncle took us to a small phone booth in the market. He dialed our village's only phone, which was located at the chief's house. After a few moments, my father's voice came through the line. "Hello," he said. My uncle handed me the phone. "Father, it's me," I said. There was a long pause. "Chinedu," my father said, his voice cold. "Why are you calling?" I took a deep breath. "I need to tell you something," I said. "Something important." My father didn't say anything, so I continued. I told him about Nneka, about what she had done to me, and how it had affected me. I told him about the pain and anger I had carried, and how it had led me to hurt Ada. I told him everything. When I finished, there was silence on the other end of the line. "Father?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Are you still there?" Finally, my father spoke. "Come home," he said. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "We need to talk." I felt a lump in my throat. "Okay," I said. "We'll come home." My uncle took the phone and spoke to my father for a few more minutes, arranging our return. When he hung up, he looked at us with a serious expression. "This is not going to be easy," he said. "But it's the right thing to do." I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and relief. We were going home. But what would happen when we got there? Would our parents forgive us? Would they believe us about Nneka? I didn't know. All I knew was that we had to face whatever was coming. We had no other choice. As we packed our bags that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Going back to the village meant facing our past, facing our family, and facing the consequences of our actions. But it also meant a chance to heal. A chance to make things right. Or at least, to try. Ada looked at me, her eyes filled with fear. "What's going to happen to us?" she asked. I took her hand and squeezed it. "I don't know," I said. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together." She nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. I felt it too. The road ahead was uncertain, and I had no idea what was waiting for us at the end of it. The next morning, we set out for the village. The journey was long and tiring, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. As we walked, I thought about everything that had happened. I thought about Nneka, about Ada, and about the baby that was coming. I thought about my parents and how they would react when they saw us. And I thought about myself. Who was I now? Was I still the boy who had been hurt, or was I the man who had hurt someone else? I didn't know. All I knew was that I had to keep going. For Ada. For the baby. And for myself. When we finally reached the village, it was late in the evening. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the familiar huts and trees. As we walked toward our house, I felt a mix of emotions, fear, guilt, and a strange sense of hope. But as we got closer, I noticed something strange. The house was dark, and there was no one outside. No children playing, no women cooking, no men talking. It was eerily quiet. My heart started to race. Something was wrong. We reached the front door, and I knocked softly. There was no answer. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was empty. My stomach dropped. Where was everyone? Ada grabbed my arm, her face pale, wondering what had happened. And then, I heard a voice behind me. There at the backyard, I turned around and saw Nneka standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face cold. It's all your father's fault, says Neka. I looked at Neka, and she met my gaze. I saw the pain and anger in her eyes, and I knew that I had to ask. Neka, why did you stay silent for so long? I asked. Why did you let father's abuse continue? Neka's expression changed, and for a moment, I saw a glimmer of sadness. I was scared, she said. I was scared of being rejected, of being thrown out. I was already an outsider in this family. I felt a pang of guilt. Neka was right. She was an outsider, an adopted daughter of our father's uncle. Our father had taken her in after her parents' death, but she had never been fully accepted as one of us. We had always treated her like a cousin, a friend, but not a sister. Neka's eyes blazed with anger as she confronted our father. You're responsible for everything that's happened to this family, she spat. You're the one who ruined me, who destroyed my childhood. Our father's face crumpled, and he slumped against the wall, defeated. I'm sorry, Neka, he whispered. I was wrong to hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope you can find it in your heart to understand. Neka laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. Understand? You want me to understand? You, who took advantage of a vulnerable child, who used your position of power to exploit and abuse me. Our father's eyes dropped, and he nodded, accepting the truth of Neka's words. I was wrong, Neka. I was so wrong. The room was silent, the only sound our father's ragged breathing. I felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and regret. I was angry at our father for his actions, sad for Neka and the pain she had endured, and regretful that I had not recognized the signs of abuse sooner. Ada, too, looked shell-shocked, her eyes wide with horror. How could you, father, she whispered. Our father didn't answer. He just sat there, his head in his hands, and wept. Neka's expression didn't change, but her voice cracked with emotion. You're sorry. Sorry isn't enough. Sorry doesn't undo the damage you've done. Sorry doesn't give me back my childhood. Our father looked up, his eyes pleading. Neka, please, I don't know what else to say. I was wrong, and I'm truly, deeply sorry. Neka's laughter was like a slap in the face. You're sorry. You're sorry. You're the one who's been sorry for years, father. Sorry that you got caught, sorry that you had to deal with the consequences. But you're not sorry for what you did. You're not sorry for hurting me. The room was silent again, the tension palpable. I felt like I was suffocating, like the weight of our family's secrets was crushing me. Ada looked like she was about to pass out, her face pale and clammy. Our father just sat there, his head in his hands, and wept. Neka's eyes flashed with anger, and she turned to me and Ada. You two are just as guilty, she spat. You knew something was wrong, but you didn't do anything. You just stood by and watched while I was being abused. I felt a surge of guilt and shame. Neka was right. I had suspected something was wrong, but I had done nothing to stop it. I had been too scared, too confused. And now, it was too late. I looked at Ada, and she nodded slightly. We both knew that we had failed Neka, that we had not protected her as we should have. Our father's weeping grew louder, and he rocked back and forth, his body shaking with sobs. Neka's expression didn't change, but her voice was laced with venom. You're all guilty, she spat. Every single one of you. You're all responsible for what happened to me. I felt a surge of anger, but I knew that Neka was right. We had all failed her, in one way or another. Our father's abuse had started a chain reaction of events that had ultimately led to my own abuse of Ada. And for that, I was truly sorry. I looked at Ada, and she met my gaze. We both knew that we had a long way to go to make things right. But we were willing to try. We had to try. For Neka's sake, for our own sake, and for the sake of our family. Our father's sobs slowly subsided, and he looked up at us with red, puffy eyes. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I don't know what else to say. I was wrong, and I'm truly, deeply sorry. Neka's expression didn't change, but her voice was softer. Sorry isn't enough, she said. But it's a start. It's a start to making things right. I nodded, feeling a sense of hope that I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, we could heal. Maybe we could move forward and leave the past behind. But it wouldn't be easy. It would take time, effort, and a willingness to confront the demons that had haunted us for so long. I looked at Ada, and she smiled slightly. We both knew that we had a long way to go, but we were ready to start the journey together. The days that followed were difficult. Our father's apology had been a start, but it was only the beginning of a long and painful process. Neko struggled to forgive him, and I didn't blame her. I struggled to forgive myself for what I had done to Ada. Ada, too, was struggling, trying to come to terms with what had happened to her. We all were. Our family was broken, and it would take time to heal. But we were willing to try. We had to try. For our own sake, and for the sake of our family. Our father moved out of the house, giving us space to heal. He rented a small apartment in the village and spent most of his time there, alone. He would come to visit us occasionally, but it was awkward. We didn't know how to act around him, how to forgive him. Neko was the most resistant to his apologies. She would barely speak to him, and when she did, it was with a coldness that chilled me to the bone. I understood her anger, but I also knew that our father was genuinely sorry. He was trying to make amends, to prove himself to us. And slowly, gradually, we began to forgive him. Not for what he had done, but for trying to make things right. Ada was the first to forgive him. She had always been the most compassionate of us, the most willing to listen and to understand. She would talk to our father for hours, listening to his apologies and his promises to change. And slowly, she began to trust him again. Neko was the hardest to convince. She had been hurt the most, and she had the most to forgive. But even she began to see that our father was genuinely sorry. He was trying to make amends, to prove himself to us. And slowly, gradually, we began to heal. As the weeks turned into months, our family began to heal. We would have dinner together occasionally, and our father would come to visit us more often. He would play with Ada's baby, laughing and smiling in a way that I hadn't seen in years. And Neko, too, began to soften. She would talk to our father occasionally, and even smile at him. It was a small smile, but it was a start. Our family was healing, slowly, gradually. We would never be the same, but we could learn to forgive. We could learn to move on. And as I looked at my family, I knew that we would be okay. We would survive. We would even thrive. Because in the end, family was everything. And we had each other. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. This way, you'll get to indulge in more enchanting stories, carefully crafted to transport you to worlds of wonder and awe. Thank you for watching.